The 2023 Formula One season opened with a pretty clear display of dominance by the Red Bull team. Many people have speculated that the Red Bull RB19 is in fact invincible this season. But there are a few reasons why Red Bull might not be entirely unbeatable. In fact, quite serious reasons for the Red Bull team. But to understand those reasons, we really need to take a look at the Red Bull RB19 itself. And to do that, we have to go all the way back to the launch of the car, or at least the so-called launch of the car, in New York City. When Red Bull took the wraps off what they originally claimed to be the RB19, turned out actually to be a re-stickered version of last year's car, the RB18. The first time anybody really got a clear look at the RB19 was in pre-season testing in Bahrain. And what they saw was actually surprisingly similar to the car that was launched in New York, in that the overall concept of the Red Bull RB19 has pretty clearly carried over from the Red Bull RB18. The continuity is perhaps one of the biggest strengths of the car. Red Bull has taken a look at what worked in 2022 and what didn't work so well and optimized around that. And you can see that with the overall design of the car. Starting at the front of the car, for example, you can see that very distinctive pull rod front suspension, one of only two teams in Formula One in 2023 with that solution on display. The other team being McLaren, who are having far less success with a very similar car concept to Red Bull, but Red Bull have got it working quite nicely. Looking further down the car, you can see more similarities between the RB19 and the RB18, and one of the most distinctive concepts of the RB18 has carried on to the 2023 car. You can see that here on the side pod duct, that little protruding lip below the main side pod duct. That's something that was introduced on the RB18, it's carried through, and it's something Red Bull seem quite happy with. So the details there on the car are pretty much of a muchness. So you will see those sort of similarities, that sort of DNA existing all the way through the cars. And this is something of a trademark of Adrian Newey, who of course draws all of his cars out by hand in his office in Milton Keynes, and digitised and then developed forwards. It's a bit of an anachronism. He finds it works quite well for him. I think everybody else in the paddock is inclined to agree. Of course, not everything on the RB19 is exactly the same as the RB18. There were some rule changes, particularly around the floor of the car during the closed season between 2022 and 2023. And that saw the floor edges being raised by 15 millimeters. Sounds a very small amount, made a massive change to how the cars work, particularly with some of the question marks around cars bouncing and porpoising, something Red Bull didn't suffer from particularly as the season went on last year. Other teams like Mercedes suffered much worse. Red Bull, though, developed their floor, and that seems to be working. They've got a very detailed, intricate floor on the RB19, and it is a source of envy for other teams and manufacturers up and down the pit lane. Around the rear of the car, you can see some really interesting details as well. There's been a lot of speculation about the rear suspension of the Red Bull, how it interacts with the lower beam wings, the diffuser, and actually Red Bull have been a little bit cagey about getting a good look at the rear of the car, particularly in the mandatory show and tell sessions before every Grand Prix weekend. So here is a good look at the rear of the Red Bull RB19, and you can see that very distinctive pushrod rear suspension. There is that suspension pushrod just running up from the base of the upright to the inboard torsion bars in the middle. You can just see the top of those actually just up here. That layout is the exact opposite of what Ferrari have got. So perhaps, well, I would say the two front-running teams in Formula One, but Aston Martin skews that a little bit. But the two most favoured teams, shall we say, in Formula One have the exact opposite suspension arrangements. Now, it's around the rear of the RB19 where we see Red Bull's first real weakness in the 2023 season. And you get a little bit of a hint of that when you take a look at the airbox of the car, just located here behind the driver's head in the roll hoop. This has been quite significantly reshaped, as has the airbox of the AlphaTauri, and that's because Honda has made some developmental changes to the V6 engine and power unit that powers both the AlphaTauri and the Red Bull. Development on power units is officially banned. However, because Honda didn't have absolutely perfect reliability in the 2022 season, they were able to develop the power unit to improve reliability. And with reliability comes additional performance. It's sort of inevitable in engineering. You make it stronger, it might be a bit heavier, but it should perform a bit better. You might be able to run it a little bit harder. That's what Honda hoped for, and they did do that development, and it should be helping out Red Bull. Well, in theory, what they should have is a more reliable, more powerful or better performing power unit in the back of that Red Bull and the back of the AlphaTauri. However, the first of those two targets may have been missed at the start of this season. We've seen some hybrid issues for the Red Bull team with their Honda power unit, and in Saudi Arabia, Nick de Vries had to miss out on one of the free practice sessions because the engineers found something in his Honda power unit they didn't like the look of. That took one power unit out of his very limited pool, so that means there's probably penalties coming for that AlphaTauri driver. But in reality, those power units are identical across all 4 Honda-powered cars, so it probably means there's going to be issues on all of those cars, and that means grid penalties later in the season. It looks pretty likely that all of the Honda-powered cars are going to get it. Honda, of course, though, is not the only power unit supplier to have these issues. We've all seen the problems with Ferrari as well. This isn't the end of the world for Red Bull, however, because if you do have reliability problems with your power unit, you are able to develop it in season to improve reliability. And of course, those reliability improvements can bring performance. So it's not the end of the world. Of course, that's not the only problem at the rear of the Red Bull. We saw in Saudi Arabia a few problems for the transmissions, the gearboxes on both of the works Red Bulls. Sergio Perez had to change his gearbox to his second gearbox ahead of qualifying, and Max Verstappen made a similar change a little bit later into the session. In Q2, Max Verstappen suddenly found a problem with the drive shaft of his car. That took the second gearbox out of the pool for Max Verstappen. Now, when I asked Christian Horner about why they changed from the first gearbox to the second gearbox at only the second race of the year, when you're only allowed 4 gearboxes for the entire season, he simply told me they just wanted to put another gearbox into the pool for the drivers to use. That's not really how it works, because by using up that second gearbox, yes, you can run it forward through the rest of the season, but you wouldn't do that in the second race for no reason unless you found that there was an issue with the first gearbox you used. Well, Max Verstappen, after that transmission problem, after that drive shaft failure in qualifying in Saudi Arabia, had to revert to his race 1 gearbox, the one that they'd already swapped out of his car. Well, we heard in the race in Saudi Arabia, and we heard in free practice in Melbourne, the Dutch driver complaining about the shifting on that transmission. And I wonder, is that a slight issue with the transmission that Red Bull have detected? Maybe they think they can drive around it, or the Dutchman can drive around it, but it does suggest there may be a little bit more reliability problems to come for that transmission. So why don't Red Bull just put in a third gearbox into that car and run to the end of the season? If they think they're going to get power unit penalties anyway, you might as well stick a new gearbox in when you stick a new power unit in, because you're going to take the same penalties at the same time. Gearboxes in Formula 1 in 2023 are a little bit like power units in that the overall specification is essentially frozen for the year, but you are allowed to make changes for reliability. So perhaps that's what Red Bull's strategy is, to revert to gearbox 1 for Max Verstappen until they solve the potential reliability issues on the transmission, and then roll in gearbox 3 when those are resolved. That could be their strategy. We'll have to wait and see as the season progresses. Bit of a gap till race 4, so maybe they'll use that time wisely, because the engineers are allowed to go to work over that Easter break for everybody else. But there are some more fundamental issues for Red Bull to overcome, and there's a little hint to that when you look at the front end of the car. In Melbourne, they introduced a new specification of front wing and some revisions to the front wing end plate on the car. Now, these changes seemed pretty normal for an F1 team to introduce at this point of the season. Not a huge amount of upgrades on many cars in Melbourne anyway. It's a flyaway race early in the season, maybe not too much change to come. You're going to wait till you get to Barcelona perhaps for lots and lots of upgrades. But for Red Bull, it's important they bring these upgrades early on, because Red Bull are very scared that they're going to start to lose performance relative to all of their competition as the season progresses. And this is all to do with the aerodynamic testing restrictions introduced by Formula 1 recently. What these restrictions mean is that the team who finishes last in the World Championship gets the biggest amount of time in the wind tunnel, whereas the team who finishes first, who wins the World Championship, gets the least. And the differences between first and last are pretty stark. But they're extremely stark in 2023. Because Red Bull breached the cost cap in 2021, they received quite a significant penalty in that their wind tunnel testing allowance was quite severely reduced. And you can see that very clearly looking at this table here. Take a look at Red Bull. They've got 756 hours in the wind tunnel, 605 wind tunnel tests, and 151 hours of wind on time. Now, I'll explain those in a second. Compare that to Aston Martin, at the moment second in the World Championship. They've got 1,200 hours in the wind tunnel, 960 experiments, and 240 hours of wind on time. That means they've got almost twice the amount of aerodynamic testing allowance than Red Bull has, who are leading the championship. This means, in theory, Aston Martin have twice the amount of development scope on their car for this year and for next year. Of course, wind tunnel hours are not the whole story. This table doesn't include CFD, the virtual wind tunnel. That's because it's quite complicated to work out the difference between the wind tunnel hours and the CFD allowance, because it's a sort of seesaw, and teams can sort of pick how much CFD they use opposed to how much wind tunnel time, and the FIA oversee this process quite strictly. So the teams can use a bit more CFD and get a bit less wind tunnel, or a bit more wind tunnel and get a bit less CFDs. However, let's explain these points. Hours in the wind tunnel, well, that's pretty clear. That's not testing in the wind tunnel. Once the wind tunnel model is on the moving ground plane, or the belt in the working section of the wind tunnel, that's how much time the mechanics and engineers are allowed to fiddle around with that wind tunnel model. That's how much physical time they're allowed to spend sitting in that wind tunnel doing their work. So that's quite different to wind on time. Now, wind on time is once the wind, the airflow gets going over the model, but not as soon as you switch the fans on in the wind tunnel. It's once that flow is stabilized to the set speed that the teams want. The number of wind tunnel tests, well, it's a bit like doing physics at school. That's the number of experiments you're allowed to run. And at the start of each individual test, because a test doesn't take an hour to do, it might take it depends how long it takes for the wind to stabilize, but it might take 15 minutes, it might take half an hour, it might take 5 minutes, depends on what you're really working on the car. Well, that's what the number of experiments they're allowed to have. So maybe 605 different iterations of cars. So, for example, that could be 605 different front wing versions if you didn't develop anything else on the car. So 605 different ideas that they can test in the wind tunnel. Look down at Aston Martin again, 960 ideas that they can test in the wind tunnel. Now, the FIA monitor these experiments really closely. So after each individual test, they take a picture before and after of the model, so it can be really strictly controlled. For Red Bull, they face an additional problem on this. The Red Bull wind tunnel is the oldest in use in Formula One. It was originally actually built by the British government for developing Cold War aircraft, such as the Panavia Tornado. It originally had wooden flat fan blades, and they were only replaced a few years ago. Red Bull has, of course, continually upgraded that wind tunnel since they acquired it from a couple of other Formula One teams. But actually, it's still quite an old relic of the Cold War, as Christian Horner famously described it, and he wasn't really wrong. Red Bull has recently lodged a planning application for a completely new state-of-the-art wind tunnel at its factory in Milton Keynes to replace the facility that it has in Bedford, that old Cold War facility. But using such an old facility with restricted wind tunnel hours could really hold the team back, even though they're really far in front. I wondered what impact this was going to have on Red Bull's development as the year went on, so I decided to go down to the pit garage and ask Red Bull engineer Paul Monaghan about it, and this is what he had to say.
I don't think we can, at this point of a season, say that we have any sort of car advantage that can last, because the others can catch up. So there becomes a trade during the year, and it will depend on the competitive level of this championship and what emphasis we place on this one, whether we think we can get over the line or not, versus the needs for next year's car. Everybody will play that trade. We just do it with fewer hours and fewer runs than everybody else, which makes it a little bit harder. I suppose you could argue it's more rewarding if we get over the line and can do next year's one.
Interesting comments there, I thought, from Paul Monaghan, but does that mean Red Bull can really be beaten? Well, that's not really up to Red Bull, or even how they develop this year's car or next year's car, and whether they move their resources around between them. It's actually really down to other teams, particularly Ferrari and Aston Martin. Can they use their advantage in aerodynamic testing allowance? Can they use their advantage in potential car reliability? Well, not if you're Ferrari, but maybe if you're Aston Martin, to catch up to Red Bull as the season progresses. It's all going to be crucial around that June date when the aerodynamic testing restrictions reset. It looks like Red Bull still have the smallest restriction, but Aston Martin is going to lose a lot of wind tunnel time at that point, I suspect, as well, if they continue with the form they're already showing. So it could be that Aston Martin have got a lot of work to do in the first half of the season, because that'll help them all the way through the rest of the year. But the Red Bull RB19, is it unbeatable? Well, you'll just have to watch Formula One for the rest of 2023 to find out.